The Mexican War. James K. Polk was affectionately known as Young Hickory because he looked something like the old general, Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson. And of course, he shared his principles. James K. Polk was a Southerner, a Jacksonian, and as such, it should come as no surprise that he announced that his intentions as President of the United States were to be to reduce the tariff. Jackson had wanted to reduce the tariff, and of course that had led to problems with South Carolina when Jackson did not reduce the tariff as quickly as the South Carolinians wanted. You may recall the nullification crisis. That sounds like a great question on the exam. In addition to continuing to reduce the tariff, James K. Polk wanted to acquire new territory out west, specifically California and Oregon. And while it's obvious as to why Polk would want to acquire Oregon, I haven't yet figured out why he wanted California. Okay, thank you for this smile there. That was good. I appreciate that. Some of you were wondering, hey, I'm from California. What's wrong with me? Nothing. That was just a joke. What was surprising, and the reason many historians rate him highly, is that he accomplished his goals. He told the American people what he wanted to do. He set out to do it, and he did it. This is rare in American history. Those who are critical of James K. Polk are not critical of the fact that he failed to accomplish his goals or what have you. They're critical of the goals themselves. They thought the tariff should be high, and they saw no reason to add Oregon or California to a relatively peaceful, prosperous, and growing United States. They thought it might just cause trouble. And in the end, they were at least half right. Polk pressed Congress to pass the Walker Tariff of 1846, which lowered tariff rates. So there's his accomplishment. And the president then pressured Great Britain, who owned the Oregon Territory, or at least a goodly portion of it. He pressured Great Britain into the Oregon Treaty of 1846, and so the Oregon Territory, including the modern states of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, came into the United States by negotiation with Great Britain. So remember that fact, and you will not be led astray by any strange questions on the exam. The Pacific Northwest comes into the United States from Great Britain as a part of a negotiation. No war necessary. Origins of the Mexican War. You see, California will not come into the Union through peaceful negotiation. And Polk wants California. And the rest of the American Southwest, frankly. The annexation of Texas had occurred during the Tyler administration, and here the author of your text somewhat leads you astray because he writes about the annexation of Texas and then moves on to the Mexican War as if it were all one topic, and it's not. You need to separate the annexation of Texas into the United States from the Mexican War. They are separate. They're related, but they are separate topics. And so don't be confused by that. And so the annexation of Texas had already occurred before the Mexican War. It occurs during the Tyler administration that just immediately preceded Polk's. But the results did not hit the proverbial fan until Polk took office. So Tyler gets Texas in, and then the results, the anger of the Mexicans over the annexation of Texas is going to hit Polk, okay? He's going to have to deal with the mess. 2 days after Polk's inauguration, the Mexican ambassador broke off relations with the United States. And that is always a precursor to a possible, anyway, war. So the Mexican ambassador goes home in a huff over the annexation of Texas. Polk tried easing the situation, but privately, he was encouraging the people, especially the American people out in California, to rise in rebellion against Mexico. California is a Mexican territory, as is all of the American Southwest at this time, except for what? Texas. Texas had been an independent state after the Texas Revolution, and then it had been brought into the United States, as I've already explained. So clarify that in your minds. Texas is already in the Union, and it had been an independent nation for 9 years. If you get that fact, then this will make sense. If you don't, it'll just be confusing. And so Polk now is encouraging rebellion in California, while he is publicly trying to ameliorate the situation with Mexico. And so the American representative in California began to line up Americans and Californians. How are Americans different from Californians at this time? Good question. I'm glad you asked. California is a very diverse place then and now. There were Americans who had gone out to California, but there were also people of Hispanic descent who had created a California culture, and many of them owned vast rancheros, haciendas. And they raised cattle and agriculture and all kinds of things. These are the Californios, okay? And they are a significant number of people. And then, of course, there are also what? Native Americans. Yeah, the Americans there, people who have come from the United States and settled in California. Native Americans and Hispanics. Just to name the three most obvious groups. Meanwhile, Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to take troops into Texas and all the way down to the southern part of Texas, and here I'm being a little fast and loose with the truth, take them past the Nueces River, which was the southern border of Texas. Why is that surprising? What's the southern border of Texas today? Rio Grande, the big river. Okay, well, the Nueces is north of the Rio Grande. And so Polk now orders Taylor to take his troops all the way south to the Rio Grande, which was considered Mexican territory at this time. The border being the Nueces, you see. So this is a provocation to the Mexicans to do something about this invasion of their territory, which is exactly what Polk wanted. See, the Mexicans recognized neither the annexation of Texas. Remember, they're angry over the fact that Texas is now being entering into the United States. They were angry over the fact that Texas had rebelled against Mexico and had been independent. That was bad enough. But now to enter into the United States, that was adding insult to injury. That was like saying, you're never going to get Texas back. Of course, they wanted Texas back. And so the Mexicans didn't recognize the Rio Grande as the southern border of Texas. They saw that as the Nueces. That had been the historic border of Texas. So you have double insult now. And Whigs of the day, this is the other party in America now, the Democrats, of course, of Jackson and Polk, the Whigs of the day, the heirs of the Federalist tradition, those opposed to Jackson, they sympathized with Mexico. They thought Mexico had a legal argument regarding the border and such. Okay? They don't sympathize with Mexico over the Texican rebellion and all. That's all ancient history now. Okay? But they do sympathize with Mexico over the border. You see, Texas had been, as I've already said, independent for 9 years. And the lawful Mexican government of that time had signed a treaty with Texas. This is Santa Anna. Perhaps you've heard of Santa Anna. And so what I'm arguing today is that this was an issue decided by war and the treaty had been signed. So in human affairs, this is a legitimate way, a recognized way of settling disputes. War. If you don't think this is legitimate, just ask the Japanese in 1945. Or the Germans, same year. This is human history. It's the way it is. Doesn't necessarily mean the war was legitimate, but the way the wars end, that matters, whether righteously or unrighteously. And the Texicans had a legitimate complaint against the government of Mexico in 1836. They did. But this is not Texas history. This is American history. All right? For their part, the Mexicans in 1846 refused to negotiate. They don't want to give up California. They don't want to give up their understood border of Texas, the Nueces, which is, of course, what they're being asked to give up. And in addition to that, the rich province of New Mexico, Santa Fe, etc. What's going on here is that the United States is in the middle of a massive land grab. Pure and simple. This land grab, this aggressive behavior on the part of the United States is the cause of the Mexican War. If the United States had not wanted California and New Mexico and to change the border of Texas, there would have been no war. The Mexicans would still have been unhappy about Texas, but not likely to cause a war. Now, in the spring of 1846, after Taylor had placed his men down there on the Rio Grande, Polk received word that the Mexicans had crossed the Rio Grande into what they regarded as their own country and attacked Taylor's men that they saw as an invading force. And Taylor had suffered 11 men dead. Polk now argued that American soldiers had been killed on American soil. And the country's honor and self-defense was at stake. The truth is that Polk had placed Taylor's men in harm's way, hoping for just such an incident, and the Mexicans, to be perfectly blunt and honest about it, had stupidly obliged him. I say stupidly, given the results of the war. Although I don't know of any other nation that would have behaved any differently. Your country's been invaded, right, by armed force. Opposition to the war. Yeah, there are Americans who are opposed to this war. They see it for exactly what I've told you it was. It's demonstrative of the regional split in the United States that there was substantial opposition to the war. Southerners and Westerners were all for the war because they saw the opportunity to move out west, take more land. Northerners, especially New Englanders, had no reason to want to move out west, and they saw no reason for the war. So it's a north-south-west split. John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, a one-term president of the United States in the 1820s, and one of the most important and respected voices in America at this time, was a staunch opponent of this war. He called it, and I quote, a most unrighteous war. Again, he sees it as a land grab. A land grab, by the way, in the interest of Southerners who want to move out west into the Southern territories and take their what with them? Yeah, their slaves. So a war for the extension of the country, for the interests of Southerners and the expansion of slavery in the West. John Quincy Adams. And then there was a very obscure one-term congressman from the state of Illinois, tall fellow, 6'5". And he's in Congress now during the Mexican War. And the reason he's only a one-term congressman is because the war was popular in Illinois and he is opposed to it. He consistently and continuously introduced spot resolutions in Congress saying of the Polk administration, show me the spot on American soil, there's the key word, where American blood has been shed. And he's implying that the Mexicans are just in their claim that the area between the Nueces and the Rio Grande was Mexican soil, not American soil. And of course, I'm talking about Abraham Lincoln. And a number of years ago, I was reading the memoirs of a great American general, Ulysses S. Grant. And Grant, as a young officer, fought in the Mexican War. And then later in the Civil War, of course, he would lead northern forces to victory over the South. Abraham Lincoln's chief military officer. And then after the war, he wrote a memoir of his life. And in that memoir, he wrote that the Mexican War, in which he fought as a young officer, was an unrighteous war, an unholy war, a war for land, an aggressive war on the part of the United States. And when I read that and I remembered what Lincoln had said and I remembered what Adams had said, I began to think, you know what, these are three men I respect. How could they be wrong about the Mexican War? And that's what changed my mind. I was reading about Lincoln and Adams and Grant. Many New Englanders believed that the war was the work of land jobbers and slave jobbers, those who wanted more land and those who wanted to take their slaves into the land. The Massachusetts poet James Russell Lowell wrote, "They just want this California so's to lug new slave states in, to abuse you and to scorn you and to plunder you like sin." Yeah, he's not pulling any punches here, folks. Poets seldom do. So the primary cause of the war was American greed for Mexican land, particularly California and the rest of the Southwest. And Southerners especially wanted these lands to take their slaves and their cotton fields out west. Zachary Taylor's campaign in Texas. So there's Taylor, and he's been attacked. He's on the Rio Grande. War has been declared. Zachary Taylor's men scored 2 early victories against Mexican forces who had crossed the river and attacked him. And then in May 1846, Taylor himself crossed the Rio Grande into northern Mexico and occupied a city called Matamoros. This victory at Matamoros brings Taylor instant fame. And in those days, a general who is becoming famous is a potential what? Yeah, presidential candidate. You bet. California. The great prize, California. The Californians had not waited for war to be declared. They have their own agenda. The United States rather surreptitiously aided California when John Charles Fremont, an American military officer, cavalry officer, who'd gone out west and then up to Oregon, when Fremont then turns around, heads south again to invade California. We commemorate Fremont's exploration and exploits out here in Portland area. We've named a bridge after him in Portland, across the Willamette, right? Fremont Bridge, Big Blue Bridge. Now you know. Next time you cross the Willamette River over the Fremont Bridge going north to Seattle into not British territory anymore. The state of Washington. You can tell who's ever with you, put them to sleep, hopefully they're not driving, that the bridge is named after John Charles Fremont. I say all that just to help you remember. I'm always trying to help you guys out. So, Fremont then invades Northern California. And pretty soon, Fremont took Sonoma. And the Californians, of course, with Fremont's help, they raised the Bear flag. The Bear Flag Republic. For a few months, the Californians are an independent nation. It's called the Bear Flag Republic. In imitation of who? Texas. Now, Texas had been an independent nation for 9 years. The Californians aren't going to last that long because they never really intended to be an independent republic. It sounded good at the moment. But the Californians commemorate the Bear Flag Republic by putting what on their flag today, the state flag? Yeah, the bear, a grizzly bear. The University of California, Los Angeles, or what? The Bruins. The lesser Bruins, I know, but they are the Bruins. And the University of California in the Bay Area, what are they? Again, I'm just trying to help you guys out. Not going to be on the test. Yeah, the Golden Bears, right? Yeah. The Bears. Bear Flag Republic. The American Navy now quickly takes Monterey out there on the California coast, now the home of many famous golf courses. And the United States Navy now claims California for the United States. None of this Bear Flag Republic nonsense. Most of the Californians preferred to be part of the United States, so the whole Bear Flag Republic thing goes away rather quickly. In July, a naval officer by the name of Robert Stockton joined his naval forces to Fremont's cavalry coming overland, and they invaded Southern California. Resistance was weak. Mexico had a very difficult time holding on to this territory. Their forces in California are minimal. And so Southern California falls. And by the end of August 1846, in a matter of just a few months, all of California belongs to the United States. At the same time, an American military force crossed over the west and invaded New Mexico and took Santa Fe. And so now New Mexico and all of that territory falls to the United States. Again, very quickly, relatively easily. So in a few months of 1846, the present-day American Southwest had been taken from the Mexicans. And the vast majority of the American people have no idea what the results of the Mexican War were, or that we had taken this territory from Mexico. But let me tell you, Mexico has not forgotten to this day. Taylor in northern Mexico. In September 1846, Taylor left Matamoros and begins to move south again. Now, I know this is confusing, but there is another Mexican city, Monterey, in north central Mexico. Okay, and there's the one in California, where all the golf courses are. And then there's the one in north central Mexico that Taylor takes as well. And now President Polk is growing jealous of Taylor's growing military fame, because Taylor is a Whig of the party. You're going to let Taylor, if you're president of the United States and a Democrat, have all the glory of this war and conquer Mexico? Not on your life. And so he's going to order Taylor to cool his heels, and he's going to pick another military officer to take Mexico. General Winfield Scott. And so Scott then is assigned to take a second force all the way south by ship and land at Veracruz on the Caribbean, and then march inland to Mexico City and take Mexico City. I hope you all realize that this great city, the city of Mexico as it's called, is at 7,000 feet elevation. 7,000 feet. We call Denver the Mile High City because it's at 5,000 feet. Mexico City, 7,000 feet. In order to get up on that mountaintop, you got to go through the coastal jungle and then up the mountainsides through the plateaus and all that and get there. just getting there is enormously difficult, at least in those days. Scott's campaign. So he does. He lands at Veracruz in March of 1847, the next year. And he begins to move his troops up through the jungle and then up through the mountains. Once he achieves the mountains, he encounters a series of Mexican defenses of Mexico City. And these defenses are carefully erected amongst the lakes and the marshes and the lava fields that this old volcanic area has created. And to make matters even more difficult, the Mexicans dramatically outnumber Scott. Dramatically outnumber Scott. And so the Mexicans are confident they could repel any frontal attack. A frontal attack is when your army just advances straight onto the front of the opposing force. And the Mexicans are confident that because Scott does not know this territory, and it's very difficult terrain with the marshes and again the volcanic rough areas and such and the lakes, and that there's no way that Scott can maneuver his forces to engage in a flank attack. A flank attack is where you try to maneuver your force around to the sides of the enemy, the flanks, and surprise them. But the terrain is so difficult that the Mexicans don't think that Scott can do this. So they're only worried about frontal attacks. Nevertheless, Scott decides on a flanking strategy. Got to find a way around these frontal defenses. And so Scott is going to need someone who can engage in reconnaissance, which just is a fancy way of saying scouting. Find the route to the flanking attack, find his way back, and then again lead the American forces along the route that he's discovered, and he will have to do most of this in the dark, otherwise the Mexicans would see this person. And so Scott now entrusts that task to a young captain by the name of Robert E. Lee. And if that name, Robert E. Lee, sounds vaguely familiar, and I hope it does, it's because of who Robert E. Lee becomes in the Civil War. As he will lead the army of the South, not entirely for the 4 years, but almost the entire 4 years. And it's probably because of Robert E. Lee that the war lasts for 4 years. Because Robert E. Lee is nothing less than a military genius. And he demonstrates this in the Mexican War. So Scott sends Lee to find a path to Churubusco that would place the Americans on the Mexican flank. And so Lee finds the path. And then he guided the army to the proper position. Still, the Mexicans responded to this flank attack and they fought well. Remnants of the Mexican forces held out in a small church, but they eventually surrendered. And the Mexicans made their last stand at the Battle of Chapultepec. Here, an old fortress on a natural rise in the ground commands the valley. And the ground is open all the way around the fortress, so there's no way to get to a flank attack. And the fortress, again, is on a rise. So there's no choice, frontal attack. Scott called for hand-picked troops, volunteers, to make the frontal assault. It took 2 days to carry this fortress. But finally, after fierce fighting, it fell in September of 1847. At the Mexican National Palace, a group of Marines ran up an American flag and thus provided some of the lyrics for the Marine hymn from the halls of Montezuma. Right? That's in Mexico City. In case you don't understand, Marines are part of the United States Navy. They are ground forces attached to the Navy, whereas the Army, of course, is separate from the Navy, and those are obviously ground forces as well. So the Marines have a long history of being elite troops. And so the Marine hymn from the halls of Montezuma, Marines are there at this battle and distinguish themselves once again. The victory at Mexico City had been made possible by two factors. First, and most important, was political infighting between the Mexican generals. The Mexicans are not united. Had the Mexicans been united and well led, there is no way this outnumbered American force could have been victorious. But that suggests an endemic problem with Mexico, doesn't it? A problem that will last well into the 20th century, that they themselves are not united. So that's number one. And number two is simply the brilliant strategy of the American invaders. Scott's strategy, his flank attacks, was dependent upon scouting, reconnaissance. And most of that scouting had been done by Robert E. Lee. Scott wrote of Lee that he was gallant and indefatigable. There's a great word. Indefatigable. He does not get tired. And that his actions were, and now I quote from Scott's letter, the greatest feat of physical and moral courage performed by an individual in my knowledge. Which brings us to the results of the war, the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo. Negotiations began in early 1848 and resulted in the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo. So you've got to ask yourself, well, what's in the treaty? Results of the war, right? Enormous for the United States, and frankly enormous for Mexico as well. Mexico gave up all claims to Texas above what? The Rio Grande. Okay, so they lost the border dispute between Nueces and the Rio Grande. Now don't write anything at this moment. Pay attention to what I'm saying. The United States does not get what as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo? We don't get Texas, okay? We already have Texas. Texas came in to the Union before the war even started. That was the Texicans, as they called themselves then, okay? Texicans. So separate Texas, other than the border dispute, from the Mexican War. I'm going back to what I was explaining at the beginning, just so you get this right. But the border dispute is resolved as a result of the war. Secondly, Mexico cedes all of California and all of the rest of the American Southwest, New Mexico, etc., Arizona, to the United States. Look at that map. California, and the modern states now, they weren't described this way at that time, but California was the Mexican cession, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and part of New Mexico. Imagine the United States without this territory. Hard to do, isn't it? This is a joke, but where would Americans go in the wintertime to get away from the snow if we didn't have this territory? The sunbirds, right? 3, and this is very, very instructive. Because in war, the victors don't pay any money, folks. In war, the losers pay. And yet, number 3, the United States agrees to pay the Mexicans $15 million. $15 million, that's a lot of money in those days. What's going on here? How about a little guilt money, huh? We'll feel better. Yeah. Further results of the Mexican War. The 17-month-long Mexican War had cost the United States 1,721 KIA. What's KIA stand for? Kill in action. Thank you. Is that going to be on the test? No. Yeah, good. You're shaking your head. It's not the kind of thing I ask you. I'm going to ask you what? Things that matter. Causes of the war, results of the war. Things that make you an informed person about your country, the United States, and an informed person about the way the world works. See? That's what matters. I want you to compare it to this, though, so you understand the way the world was. Another 11,000 Americans died in the war of disease. Look at that, 1,700 killed in action. What, 7, 8 times that number died of disease? Yeah. That's not going to change in war until the 20th century. There's medicine. Now, the military and naval actions had cost $98 million. This amount, combined with the $15 million that we're going to pay Mexico, meant that for $113 million and almost 13,000 dead, when you add the dead by disease and killed in action together, the United States had acquired 500,000 square miles, the Southwest in California. This territory, as I've already said, includes California, but it also includes the magnificent harbors at San Diego and San Francisco. These two harbors alone, it would only have needed to be one harbor like this, but these two harbors will make the United States eventually a Pacific power. Indeed, the United States Pacific Fleet is stationed at San Diego. Now, these territories contained incalculable mineral wealth and incalculable agricultural wealth. These annexations rounded out the continental United States, except for the Gadsden Purchase in 1853. The cost to Mexico was also incalculable. Porfirio Diaz would rule Mexico for 35 years in the late 19th century and into the 20th century as a dictator, but that tells you a story right there. Mexico is in a state of anarchy, and so only a dictator can solve their political problems, which he does for 35 years. But he leaves us a wonderful quote that tells us how Mexico feels about its relationship to the United States. And I'll have to explain it. But Diaz said, "Alas, poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States." Mexico is a Catholic country. And as far as most Americans were concerned, and the vast majority of Americans are what? Protestant. And in the 19th century, that mattered a great deal. Here in the early 21st century, a lot of Protestants and Catholics see themselves as on the same side of many issues, okay? There's an identity there. But not then. And so Porfirio Diaz is saying, "Alas, poor Mexico," and he's alluding to this Catholic-Protestant split. So far from God, as far as Americans are concerned, see. But so close to the United States. As I've already said, many Americans felt guilty about taking the Southwest from Mexico. Ralph Waldo Emerson, another one of our great writers, rejected war as a means of achieving American destiny. See, Emerson, the transcendentalist writer, is somebody who believes in manifest destiny, that God has a purpose for the United States. But as a result of the Mexican War, Emerson is saying, not by war. People of the day increasingly saw the war as one of conquest, provoked by a president determined upon expansion. Some later recognized what historian Daniel Walker Howe, and Howe is one of my favorite historians, what Howe observed 160 years later in his volume of the Oxford History of the United States. He said that the Mexican War brought territory into the United States was to be something of a curse. He's right. For within a dozen years, the argument over the extension of slavery into these territories that came in from Mexico would become so heated that civil war was unavoidable. I was telling you that we swallowed this Mexican cession, and it was like arsenic that nearly destroyed us in civil war. Because we are going to argue whether these new territories are going to be slave or free. And it's this argument over the slave or free condition of the Western territories that are going to bring on civil war. Okay? And that will be one of the themes of the last quarter of the class. On the other hand, some historians argue that Polk merely hastened what the march of the American pioneer was determined to achieve anyway. And this is absolutely true in my opinion, although we can't say for sure because we can't know for sure what would happen because it didn't happen, right? But we can say probably, and I do say probably. Remember I said that Mexico only held these territories only weakly? Their military force in these areas was not very strong. And then once gold is discovered in California, which is going to be discovered in 1848, right at the end of the Mexican War, not only American people, but people from all over the world are going to flock to California. How's Mexico going to hold California then? That's what I'm talking about. Okay. So it's very unlikely that Americans and Mexicans in California and New Mexico would have remained under the dictator Diaz. It is probably, here's the probably, it is probably true that Mexico could never have held these territories. But that does not excuse what America did. Not at all. Finally, many of the American military officers who would play major roles in the Civil War received extensive military experience in the Mexican War. And the list is like a who's who of the Civil War. Ulysses S. Grant. And just dozens and dozens of others. But most important was easily Robert E. Lee. Captain Lee emerged from the Mexican War with a well-deserved reputation as being the finest young military officer in the United States Army at that time. Period. His commanding general, Winfield Scott, called Lee a military genius. The coming Civil War would demonstrate just how accurate that description was, sadly. Questions? Yes? Okay, the first 2 points of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Somebody has it. Point 1. Okay, establish the border between the Nueces and the Rio Grande, so it's the American interpretation that prevails. Good. What's point 2? Somebody be bold. Yeah. Yeah, and you don't have to enumerate them past California, but California and the American Southwest is fine. Okay, good. What's point 3? Yeah, the U.S. pays Mexico $15 million. That's the blood money, okay? Good. All right. Any other questions? Yes?
Why didn't the U.S. just buy the states outright?
There was an attempt at that, but Mexico won't sell. Okay? Yeah, good question. Mexico won't sell.
And then, in their bloodlust for land grabbing, why didn't they just continue pushing further down into Mexico?
Very good question. Why don't we just continue into northern Mexico and take perhaps all of Mexico? After all, at the end of the war, we've captured Mexico City. Okay, now why isn't Mexico now 10 more states and we have 60 states in the Union? Why not?
Because then we also have to make every Mexican a citizen, or they have to go somewhere else.
We would have to make every Mexican a citizen. And what color are most Mexicans? They're not white. Okay, now there are a number of white Spaniard Hispanics, okay? But the vast majority of the Mexican people are not white. And the United States is a racist country at this time. The vast majority of the American people are racist at this time, and well into the 20th century. Okay, great question, good answers, thank you. Anybody else? So in case that wasn't clear, we actually have this discussion, and we actually decide not to take the rest of Mexico, and the primary reason is because of the race issue, okay? All right, I'll see you next time.